Good afternoon, everyone. This is Karen Jahanian from KMJ Consulting. We're going to get started in a few minutes with our webinar on shared transportation services leveraging GTFS with regional partners. As you know, this webinar is being sponsored by the I-95 Corridor Coalition with NJTPA as the presenter on a really awesome project that they are nearly complete, and we're very excited to have them share their experience and their insight. And we will begin in another minute or so. I see several participants that are joining as we speak. Okay, well, the hour is upon us, and again, this is the webinar on shared transportation services leveraging GTFS with regional partners, and we are really excited that you can all join us today. This is Karen Jahanian. I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items and then pass it over to our main presenters for the day. We are all in listen-only mode. And however, the webinar is going to be recorded and will be available for anyone who registered by link to the I-95 Corridor Coalition website as soon as it is posted in the next couple days. Today, since we are in listen-only mode, any questions that you have will be, please type them into the chat box. And we will be monitoring that chat box, and at the end of each segment, we will pose the questions, and they will be answered by our team of presenters. So with that, I would like to introduce Denise Marco from the I-95 Corridor Coalition to give a brief welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Hello to everyone on the call, and thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to, I think, a good presentation from NJTPA. The coalition has been very, I guess I'm going to say, thankful. We were able to support this project, beginning with an initial webinar last year and finishing up with this webinar now. NJTPA has been great to work with, and we hope that you certainly enjoy the presentation coming up. But before we get there, of course, there's the shameless plug that I have to make for the Corridor Coalition. For those of you that are not aware, the coalition is comprised of our 16 state DOTs, typically, along with some other agencies, but 16 member agencies, DOTs, and the District of Columbia. We work closely with them. The coalition, I have to admit that these numbers are a little old. We are in the process of updating them, but currently, right now, this slide says 35% of the nation's VMT, but we really are closer to 40%. So 21% of all road miles traveled in the country really comes up and down this corridor. And if you think about it, when you talk about greater than 100 miles of trips annually, there's about 565 million of these along the corridor. So there's a lot going on I-95. And we are considered the third largest economy in the world. So the question was asked to me a while ago about what does this mean? How can we better message TSMO strategies regionally? Well, part of what the coalition is trying to do, and the webinar today is evidence of that, is that we're trying to become a little more multimodal in speaking not just on the highways, not just of passenger vehicles, but looking at freight, but also looking at transit and other modes. So TSMO strategies regionally, we're looking at becoming broader and addressing those issues. So. And lastly, who we are, again, multi-jurisdictional. We also, though, I did forget to mention, we've got 2 Canadian provinces, Quebec and New Brunswick. And beyond just the rail, marine, air, and highway, we're looking at transit specifically and how we can get better at helping to message those strategies across the corridor. And again, the coalition itself, even though it's got 16 member DOT states, it's also really a diverse makeup of MPOs, federal state officials, toll authorities, et cetera. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over, I believe, to Mary Amin so that she can continue. Mary?
Yes, thank you. Thanks Thanks, Denise and Karen. I just wanted to say a few remarks because I do, for this project, I'm wearing both hats, or two hats, both the NJTPA hat as well as I-95 Corridor Coalition co-chair of Travel Info Services and a longtime coalition member. And so this slide really is just to highlight how the coalition works with its members and across that third largest economy in the world. The coalition supports its member agencies by advancing projects that are beneficial both to the sponsoring agency as well as to other coalition members, so getting the word out. In this case, it enabled NJTPA to really add value to this project by reaching a broader audience, getting more information, providing a platform for other coalition member agencies, but still serving the initial constituency that it was designed to serve. This particular partnership is a shining and really new example of the kind of things that other agencies can replicate or do. And finally, looking to the future, these kinds of partnerships are what's going to help with the important information exchange and data sharing and technology transfer that's only going to increase up and down the corridor and even within our various agencies and entities. So I would want to thank a number of people for all the effort they put into this project, and the staff of the NJTPA, many of whom I will introduce shortly, the consultants, Michael Baker, KMJ, as well as the I-95 Corridor Coalition staff, because everybody's really done a great job in pulling this together. So I'm very thankful for that. So let me go around clockwise on this slide and introduce all of the presenters. There are biographies that I'm not going to read, but we'll make sure that they're posted as part of this slide presentation. Let me start with Zenobia Fields. She is the director of the Department of Planning at the NJTPA, and she will give an NJTPA overview and deliver closing remarks at this presentation. Then Solomon Cavanes, also from NJTPA, he's our Special Projects Manager for Planning and Operations, and he'll go through the discovery phase of this project. Then I'll introduce Justin Furch from Michael Baker International. He's a GIT specialist, and he'll talk about the development phase as well as lessons learned. And last but not least is Gabrielle Fauzal. She's also with NJTPA, principal planner in GIS, and she will talk about the deployment, which was really the heavy lift of this project. And so I'm so proud to be able to introduce everyone, and I'm looking forward to getting into the detailed discussion. So with that, I'll turn things over to Zenobia.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to be talking about shared transportation services leveraging GTFS with regional partners. So what does that mean? What did it mean to NJTPA? As a metropolitan planning organization, we're charged with using our investment that we get from the Federal Highway and Transit Administration to respond to the transportation need by making transportation investments. What better investment in shared mobility than to centralize the information about our travel options? So when we're making choices, whether we're talking about our transportation options or other things, of course, having knowledge is power. So what we looked at in this project was, how are we going to empower the commuter with their options? Whether they were looking at the amount of time that would be incurred while they're waiting for a transit bus, or even having the ability to view a shuttle or a private bus service that's available on a route. Or they might be looking at, how do we arrange for an on-demand ride? What are our other options to get us out of driving alone? So first, that's the need. And what we wanted to fulfill is that gap where we're talking about in the information. So that's what we had in our work program activity. This is what we developed in one of our unified planning work programs, where we wanted to look at how do we standardize this information. So our format or our syntax for that was going to be the general transit feed specifications. And then once we had this, where we wanted to be able to share that information with a third-party vendor, we learned about one of our other partnerships with the I-95 Corridor Coalition, where there became an opportunity available where we could leverage some of the resources with the grants. One, that we could learn about what our other sister agencies were doing in terms of best practices, and two, talk about our approach and some of our lessons learned. So with that, let's go on to what we're going to talk about today and how we're going to present that to you. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how, as an MPO, we translate our policy goals into planning activities and then actions for investments that addresses the needs. In this case, we're talking about shared mobility. Then second, Solomon Cavanis, he's going to talk to us a little bit about what we had funded with the I-95 Corridor Coalition, that they gave us the opportunity to do a peer exchange. And you're going to hear a little bit about that, how that narrowed down the scope for us because we had others that went before us and that were more informed about the process. Then you're going to hear from Justin Furch. He's really going to talk about the development of that unified data model to get all those feeds in there. We work with over 15 different providers into getting a unified transit feed going in here. Then Gabrielle, she's going to talk a little bit about the deployment, really looking at the relationship building or the logistics behind developing this process. And then Justin is going to talk to us a little bit more about the lessons learned. Of course, we know anytime when you're streamlining a process, trying to make it more efficient, you're going to wish you knew something earlier or you went into a different direction. So hopefully we can share that with you if you're thinking about replicating this process. And then I'm going to come back and talk in our closing remarks. So where do we go from here? How do we want to continue to build on this process? So first, just to tell you a little bit more about our NJTPA region. So we are a 13-county region. We take up about 75% of the state. What you're seeing is that you have some of our urban areas that are over towards the northeast, going all the way down to the coast and all the way over to counties like Hunterdon that are a little more rural. I say that because we have a very diverse geographic landscape where we're thinking about how are we getting people around in the shared mobility. Then when we're thinking about our NJTPA board, who are we trying to respond to? So first you're seeing the names of all those 13 counties. You're seeing those 2 core cities. Then you're seeing our traditional transit providers. So we're talking about New Jersey Transit, Port Authority. But you're also seeing that we want to respond to some of those locals. In our case, we're talking about the counties that you're seeing in yellow and the cities that you're seeing in blue. And then others that we're looking at to guide this process. So when we're getting around looking at planning and economic development, we want to go to key destinations and places. And how are we prioritizing our projects as we're moving through. Now, this is a member of our executive committee, so you're basically seeing who we answer to. I think one of the things that you're seeing that if we start with our chair from Union County, it's a pretty urban and both suburban county. Hunterdon's suburban rural county. Passaic, they have urban, suburban, and rural conditions. I say all this so you know that we're not looking at a one-size-fits-all here, and that value added with that mobility information really helps and guides us, and we're being directed to respond to this need. Then what you're seeing right now is our MPO in a greater context. you're seeing that larger context where some of these organizations, our sister NPOs, they're also members of the I-95 Corridor Coalition, and they're tackling that same need of how are we going to address shared mobility issues. So I'll just go through a little bit about those key products when I was talking about how are we translating our policy goals. So what you're seeing over on the left, you're seeing our long-range transportation plan, our regional transportation plan that looks at a 25-year horizon. Two key goals that are coming out of that plan. We're talking about how do you have access to opportunity with mobility, and how are we creating these great places. And sometimes what contributes to a great place is that I can actually get around in it. So that's what makes it a great place. Translating those goals into actual day-to-day activities. So that middle document that you're seeing, our Unified Planning Work Program, that's our day-to-day activity. In that day-to-day activity, you'll see this consulting effort where we were looking at how are we going to fill this information gap that we have right now. Then the third document that you're seeing is our Transportation Improvement Program. That's really looking at our capital investments. How are we using our investment, in our case, $2 billion to address that need? So then when we're thinking about mobility, what you're seeing up on the screen right now, this is what we know from our regional transportation system. So we know all the traditional factors. We know about our roadway network. We know about how many miles of roadway we have. We know about the vehicles we expect, the traffic every day. We know about our transit system. In this case, what we're only reflecting right now is the transit network according to New Jersey Transit or to the Port Authority. But what we don't know is that information that we may get from some of those private carriers, what we may get from some of our other shuttle operators, those counties and municipalities. So this was really looking at, and Solomon's going to talk to us a little bit soon about those designated routes, getting additional information about what we don't know. So with that, we're getting ready to move over to the discovery phase, but I'll pause to see. I know Karen wanted to see if we had any questions at this point.
I see none, so let's move on.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll speak about our partnership with the I-95 corridor and the opportunity for us to gain experience or learn from the experience of those agencies along the corridor who have exposure to GTFS. We had a workshop back in July 2017 focused on shared transportation options. And we wanted to make sure that we could bring in those folks along the corridor who could help us gain perspective and direction. So you heard Mary Amin and Zenobia speak about this project being a partnership. So we partnered with I-95 in 3 ways. First, we looked at a peer exchange as our first phase of the partnership. Our second being developing this shared framework, and third, what we're here today with our webinar is to share some of our findings. So it was a great peer exchange with a number of stakeholders in and outside of our region. It's an all-day workshop with presentations from industry experts and local stakeholders. That included New Jersey Transit, Coach USA, one of our transportation management associations, Easy Ride, and Rutgers University. We had folks from Virginia, folks from Vermont, IBI Group, who works with Connecticut and Boston, and sub-consultant to New York State DOT also participated. Some of the value add that we got out of this came from our questions, which focused on data exchange, standardization. We talked about investments, needed in the short and long term as we, in our planning phases, are entering into this world of data exchange for GTFS. And we looked at maintenance, the scale and order of magnitude, and we initially went into this considering bike share and some other options, but we came out of it focused on more of the bus services and I guess designated routes instead of some of the on-demand routes, just so that we can focus and evolve from there. So you'll hear more about that as we move along. So with that, I will advance this and get into the actual development project purpose with Justin first. So.
Okay, all right, thank you. I don't know if we want to pause or see if there's any questions before I get into my next section.
I think you're good to go, Justin.
All right, so I'll get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Justin Furch. So I'll start with the development and really the project purpose, and I'll read this and kind of explain it. So really, project purpose was to develop a data workflow plan supporting mobile applications that improve access to shared transportation services. The plan will meet General Transit Feed Specification, or GTFS, standards and detail an interagency coordination framework for standardizing, exchanging, compiling, and maintaining shared services data for use in mobile applications. So that was a lot there. Really, and just to kind of explain really what that means is reaching out to all of the agencies within the region that provide some type of shared services. And the important thing to understand is this goes beyond your typical user, your typical agencies like New Jersey Transit, the big carriers, and looking at some of those smaller services. Taking a poll as to what data they have with regards to their schedules, their routes, their stops, those type of things. Determine how they maintain that data, bringing that data all together, in some cases having to do some data development, and then coming up with a workflow that actually makes sense to actually maintain this moving forward. So, the idea would be to keep this information that's being published as current and fresh as possible, and that includes coming up with a workflow and a maintenance plan to help facilitate that. So as I mentioned, the project goals for this is, develop lines of communication with the shared ride agencies for publishing and maintaining shared transportation data. This is critical for the data maintenance aspect moving forward. It's very important. There is a shared ride agency involvement throughout. Establishment of a standardized data template and workflow for data exchange. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Development of a geospatial database for both public and private shared transportation services. So this is kind of the core of the solution that was put together to build a unified model, to build a geospatial database that houses all of this information and then gets disseminated out in a GTFS format. And then, as I mentioned, publication of a standardized GTFS data feed. So we've talked a lot about, mentioned GTFS. For those of you that don't know what GTFS is, it's essentially a format or a data structure originally developed by Google, but sort of turned over to everybody else at some point, that provides a framework for the essential pieces of things like schedules and stops and routes and those types of information to be put into a single format and then disseminated out. There are 6 really required files, if you will, that's part of that. Agency stops, routes, trips, stop times, and calendar. Those are all text files within a single zip file. But then there's the optional information like calendar dates, fare attributes, fare rules, shapes, frequencies, transfers, and feed information that also can be part of the feed that provide additional information to riders. And understand within each of those different data elements, like so for example stops, there are fields within that are optional and required, and that gets into a little bit more detail. But that's really the basics of GTFS. It's a format that is being is quite accepted in the industry. You know, Apple, Google, all of these agencies or all of these data disseminators are now using this, so it's widely accepted. So the project really involved starting, I'll go through this, task one, you know, performing a needs assessment. That is, you know, developing a questionnaire to take a poll as to the type of data that each of the agencies had. There was data collection, data assessment, and then some of the other administrative, you know, items as part of that. Task two, data model and workflows. So this is now taking the information learned from task one and building out a model that fits the needs of the project, and then a sustainable workflow that included tool development, ETL processes, those type of things to create that GTFS unified model. Task three actually was a GTFS data conversion. So this is a case where there were several agencies that didn't have GTFS feeds available. We anticipated this, so we had to create the GTFS feeds or data sets for them so that they could then maintain that as the project goes on and as this moves into maintenance mode. And last, task four, the documentation, maintenance, and training to do a transition of all the project artifacts so that NJTPA can keep this moving once the project ends. So at the start of the project, we came up with a categorization system, categorizing data from a range from 1 to 5, starting at 1 being that, you know, the GTFS data, that an agency had GTFS data and they were publishing it online. And so the typical of that category 1 were the big agencies like New Jersey Transit and Coach and some of those. And then you kind of move your way down through those categories as all the way down to 5, which was, you know, the data was not available online. It wasn't really structured data where they had things written, at least in an Excel file or anything like that. You're talking, this is like handwritten things. What we found was actually somewhere in the middle there was a category, let's say like 1.5, you know, that was, they had a GTFS feed or data set, but they were not publishing it online. So the bulk of the transit providers that's shown there on that list in category 1, a lot of them actually were this 1.5, if you will, that middle ground where they had that GTFS data, but just weren't publishing it online. So that was one that kind of came out of the project. So coming out of task 1, some items. You know, we had 15 agencies that were part of the whole you know, the feeds. Of that, there were 23 feeds total. That means that some agencies had multiple feeds, which I think Coach had some, and there was multiple feeds for some of these. You know, there were of that 15, you know, 70% of them had GTFS feeds available or pretty close to GTFS feeds available. That just needed to be tweaked a little bit, which was kind of surprising that level of information was available. That actually was great. The other 30% had data artifacts that were available that we could use to create the feed, but they didn't really have anything structured. So we went through the process of actually developing those data sets for them so that then that data can be maintained as we move into maintenance mode. So here is the actual workflow of the data flow process and the automation piece of this whole thing. I won't go into too deep on this, but I'll kind of note that really it was broken into 2 basic flows. One for agencies that had online data, GTFS feeds already available that were posted online and regularly updated, and ones that did not. In the case of ones that had online information, New Jersey Transit, Coach, those type of other agencies, the workflow is automated completely. That means that this ETL process actually will go through. It's actually a series of Python scripts and functions that will go out, grab that feed, download it, do validation on it, and then incorporate it into a unified database. The other 30%, in which case we actually created the feeds as part of the project, those feeds and those data sets were posted on a SharePoint website by NJTPA that then it's up to those agencies to make modifications and tweaks to that data as it changes, and it's their responsibility to just go up, make those changes, and then actually a notification would be automatically sent to NJTPA that a file was changed, and NJTPA can pull that data down, just validate it, make sure it looks good, and then push it right into the feed, and then the workflow then takes care of it from there. So and part of this process and maintenance, and I'll cover it a little bit later, was actually performing online training as to how to maintain this data. Here's the tools. There were several tools that were provided as to how they were able to maintain that information. So all of that support was part of the project. So as I mentioned, the project also developed two types of templates for maintenance. It started with a macro-enabled Excel workbook or a geodatabase. Two were created because we weren't quite sure all agencies had the GIS capabilities to maintain data in a geospatial Esri ArcGIS format. So in those situations, they were able to maintain this data, this GTFS data, in a macro-enabled Excel workbook, and this is all pre-populated and all set up for them. All they would have to do is go into these files and update them. Personally, we found it a little bit easier to maintain the data in the geodatabase template which we created that's for this, just because the spatial nature of the data, you have stops and routes. As things change, you really want to be able to visually, graphically make those changes. A lot easier to deal with than an Excel file, but the option's there to maintain it however they want to. Also, we provided user training, a series of webinars and instructional manuals on how to actually do the maintenance. And once we created the data feeds for each of the agencies that didn't have data, we sent this information out to them and allowed them to validate that the information that we populated was accurate, correct, and we actually held a webinar to walk them through what they need to look for, the tools, all of those type of things, just so they kind of knew what they're doing as they're looking at this data. So the ETL process, and they've got some code up there, is really it's a Python script that was built and scheduled as a scheduled task running on a server, and really it uses a series of local storage and a SQL Server database that's tied to ArcSDE that then is able to do all of this processing that you saw in that workflow. So that's the general process. There was a couple different steps in between that does validation, that logs each step so that NJTPA can see this process as it's running, what step it's at, how and how it's progressing, if there are any errors or any of those type of things. Currently, that process is running, and I think it's running at around 3 to 4 hours, I believe it runs right now, and actually develops or pushes all that data out. So with that, I believe we'll pause and see if there are any questions on any of that. There was quite a bit of material in that.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
I don't see any questions being typed into the chat box, so how about if we move on to Gabby, and if there are any questions at the end, we can take them up. We have a question that just came in, and the question is, do you have a workflow for providing feedback, example, errors in data from, okay, and perhaps that's a zip customers back to originating agencies?
Okay, so I can mention that. This is Justin. So I think what I'm hearing is there a way to provide any feedback to the agencies based on any errors that happen in the process? So yes, there is. Through the process, the way the process works, there's a number of validation steps, and I should have mentioned this a little bit more. The validation is based off of tools that were actually are developed as part of what Google provides. So Google has a series of tools out there already created that will run through the basic validation, producing warnings and errors, based on what it finds as it runs through that process. So we found, it makes the most sense to use the Google tools that are already there. It's fully vetted. It's, they came up with the feed, so why not use that? As the ETL process combines that, runs through the validation steps, unifies the data, feedback and results are provided back to NJTPA so that then they can monitor that, and actually an daily email comes out that will then notify TPA that there was errors and warnings. Now, if it's just a warning, the process will continue on and finish. If you have an error, that agency's data will not progress any further in the process, and it will just move on and use the previous run's error or previous run's data so that it won't affect that agency's information anymore until NJTPA is able to rectify it. So what happens then is that NJTPA then contacts the agency back, can provide all the details with regards to the validation, and notify the agency that they've got these issues and that they need to address them. So hopefully I answered that question.
Well, it looks like there are a couple of follow-up, at least 3 follow-up questions that are in the chat box. And I will, so the first follow-up from Sean is, for example, and onto the question that you just asked, for example, if a mobile app developer finds something that the validators did not catch. He was kind of editing his question.
So that's a different situation. That's going to be a case where that mobile app developer should reach out to NJTPA and make them aware of what they've found. More than likely that would be and making the distinction between a data format error and maybe a data inaccuracy thing, where you're running a stop may not be at a right location, or a route may not be running where the information is saying. More than likely, hopefully, the process will pick up any of the data errors, like the actual any data formatting issues that may occur. We would be looking at more of the data inconsistencies. So that would be a case where, like I said, the developer would reach out to NJTPA and let them know.
Okay, thank you. Then we have 3 more questions. Are the GTFS data real-time or scheduled?
So the focus on this, and I think we're going to maybe cover this a little bit later on, touch on this, but when we originally looked at the project, it was kind of just, let's first start and look at what's out there, and let's consider all the options. So that meant bike shares, that meant unstructured data with regards to unscheduled type data, real time. And early on, we sort of came to the conclusion, well, in order to kind of take this in steps, it made most sense to just start with scheduled, defined routes, trips, and timetables. The GTFS format is really geared for that structure. There are separate types of feeds for things like the real-time data, for bike shares, those type of things, that would be a whole other separate piece that doesn't really fit that same model as the standard GTFS structured feed. So that was really the focus of this project.
Thank you, Justin. And then the last couple of questions. So you have all of the agencies build their GTFS feed in GIS instead of a GTFS manager? Question mark.
No, I don't know.
No, so this is Gabrielle Fossil. No, we provide them with the option of building it out in GIS or in the Excel template. Obviously, if they have their own means and mechanisms to create their GTFS feed in a software program or anything that, or other tools that they have available, then we ask that they use what they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, the templates that were provided were just for those agencies that maybe didn't have, the means to maintain it in some type of GTFS, manager.
Okay, great. And then the last two questions, and I think at that point we'll be able to move on. Is the script transferable to other regions?
I can answer that. Absolutely. The way the script or the workflow is built, it's built such that it's kind of driven off of a set of like tables, configuration tables in the main database, so that and this was meant really maybe for NJTPA's maintenance moving forward. So, for example, if an agency needs to change. Now before they weren't a structured format that were publishing online, and now they moved to publishing that data online, NJTPA can go in, tweak those configuration tables, and the script updates and it just works. There's no recoding, there's no retooling. Everything is controlled by a series of configuration tables that aid in that maintenance aspect.
Thank you. And the last question that I see here is, the speed is based on schedule, ? Correct? ?
I'm not sure what you mean. I'm not really sure what you mean by speed, like the speed of the actual, or the ETL process itself. Is it the speed of a vehicle, like of the?
Yeah, I mean.
Wait.
Let's see what we have coming in. Speed of the buses.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah, so really, and I'm trying to remember in GTFS, speed really isn't there, but I do know that we've had situations where validation will pick up on things like travel times being too fast, and that's one of the validation rules that comes up where we say, based on the geographical location of these two stops, and the travel time's too fast between stops. That actually ends up being flagged as a warning, not an error. So the process will still continue on if it flags that, but we'll still continue on.
Okay. I think I will just make a suggestion that Daniel. Okay, another comment has come in. The GTFS data we are talking about are not provided in real time.
Not real time
No.
structured data.
Right, it's not yet.
Fixed route.
Yeah, it's up to date, meaning it's the most current, but things like real-time information, on-demand stuff, that stuff is not in here. Real-time, it requires a whole other level of the data structure, the infrastructure to support it, the refresh rate. Once you start getting into real-time support, you just have to have a different setup to handle it. So.
Okay. And I think, let's see what the next comment is being typed in. Nothing. Okay, so how about if we move on to Gabby's presentation, and we still have some time at the end, of course, to take whatever remaining questions, and also for the participants, just so that at the end we'll be providing contact information for our presenters today. So if you need to or would like to contact them outside of the presentation, please feel free to do that as well. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any questions. Okay, so Gabby, you're up next.
Okay. So as previously stated, my name is Gabrielle Fossil from the NJTPA, and I'm the project manager for this project. I'll now go over the deployment phase of the project. As Justin mentioned in his presentation, developing the workflow and standard templates was an important part of the project. It provided the foundation on which the deployment was executed. Before any of the data model pieces were placed on the NJTPA IT infrastructure, the model was tested on the consultant's internal system. Working with the NJTPA IT staff, the project team ensured that the consultant's development environment mirrored the NJTPA's. A pre-deployment meeting was held at the NJTPA with the consultant and key NJTPA staff prior to the actual deployment. This meeting was pertinent to ensure an efficient and streamlined deployment of the data model. The meeting allowed the consultant to view the IT system infrastructure of the NJTPA and provide insight into gaps between the two systems and what additional requirements were needed before the deployment could commence. The deployment occurred on-site. It was a two-tiered approach. The data model and accompanying components were first installed on the NJTPA's development environment. The project team set up a task scheduler and had the script run daily for a week. Once the project team was comfortable with the process and the results, the project team was ready to deploy on the production environment. Again, this deployment was also on-site. Currently, the script is running daily, but eventually the script will be scheduled to run bi-weekly. So now that the data model and its components have been successfully installed and are running on the production server, the project team has been diligently finalizing the documentation and final report. Part of the project documentation and outreach is to clearly define the roles of the transit providers and the NJTPA. Since the information used to populate the GTFS database is derived from various transportation agencies operating throughout the state of New Jersey, data maintenance responsibilities will primarily rest with the transit providers. As you can see from the diagram of the overall workflow of the project, the agency role is outlined in red. It is the transit provider's responsibility to provide accurate and up-to-date data in their selected format. This format would be the Excel template, the geodatabase template, or a zipped GTFS validated feed. Any updated information will be uploaded to the SharePoint site. I want to note that each agency as part of the project was provided with a SharePoint folder to use to share their data, particularly those agencies who currently do not host their GTFS feeds through a web service. Alerts were set up on the folder so the NJTPA would be notified when new data was uploaded. Lastly, it is imperative any modification to a transit agency's data be provided to the NJTPA at a minimum of 2 weeks prior to the change taking effect. This will ensure accurate and up-to-date information for transit riders. The NJTPA has a significant role in the workflow as well. It is the NJTPA's responsibility to ensure the data model meets the GTFS standards. As the GTFS evolves, the NJTPA will need to make sure the model reflects any changes that occur. The consultant have done a great job creating a data model that is flexible and easily modified without having to do much coding. As you can see from the workflow, executing the script, maintaining the database, troubleshooting, and publishing the actual GTFS feeds for third-party consumption are all key requirements of the NJTPA. To help support the agency's responsibility of providing accurate and up-to-date data, the NJTPA will send a quarterly email reminding transit providers to upload or notify the NJTPA of new or updated data. So the data model, which is now deployed on the NJTPA's production server, will produce 3 GTFS feeds for third-party application use. The first feed is what the project team is calling the unified feed. This will contain all the transit services provided to us from the project and future transit services. This feed will be placed on the NJTPA website for public use. The second feed is the NJTPA Apple feed. During the course of the project team contacted Apple as a potential third-party consumer of the data. Based on conversations with an Apple representative, it became clear that a modified version of the full feed would be necessary. Therefore, Apple has a separate feed. Apple will be provided with a URL only they can access to incorporate our data into their system known as Apple Maps Transit. The last feed is Google. As we all know, Google is the creator and prime consumer of this type of data. Many of the transit providers who participated in this study already have a partnership with Google. The project team reached out to Google to learn the steps that needed to be accomplished for the NJTPA to become a partner through their Google Transit Partner Program. It was brought to the project team's attention that Google did not want feeds from the transit providers that were already fully integrated into their system. A list of all the transit providers who participated in the project was provided to Google. Google reviewed the list and responded with a revised list of only those transit providers who they currently did not incorporate. Like Apple, Google will be provided with a URL only they can access that has a fully validated GTFS feed of selected transit providers, which they can add to their Google Transit map. The benefits of this data is increased awareness of other service options for current and future transit riders. It also may help to convert potential riders into active riders. Additionally, it promotes the transit providers and their services. and all for free. So what is next? The project team has developed the templates and workflow. They have deployed the data model and accompanying components on the NJTPA infrastructure. So the project team recently finished both the user training for the transit providers and the admin training for the NJTPA. The user training was held 2 weeks ago. The training went through the transit providers' roles and responsibilities. It also provided hands-on exercises that the consultant walked participants through. The admin training occurred last week. Staff here at the NJTPA were trained on the ETL script, how to configure the database using the config tables, what to look for when troubleshooting, along with other pertinent items. Currently, the project team is reviewing and finalizing the final report and admin manual. Additionally, the project team has presented the development and final products of the project through presentations like the one we are doing today. So before we finish up the presentation, are there any questions?
Thank you, Gabby. I see 2 more questions in the chat box. 1, did any agency have problems meeting the 2-week prior requirement?
So this will be after the project is complete. So at this point, no. So as we continue to move forward with the project and as we continue to ask for updates, what we are hoping is that the transit providers that are providing us with the data, if they're making any changes, that we get notified 2 weeks before, so that when the feed is updated and pushed out to either Google, or Apple, or to our unified feed, that it is the most accurate and up-to-date data that we can provide.
Okay. And there is a second question. Why did Apple require a different version of the data than Google and other apps?
So,
if you know.
So for example, as I said in the presentation, that Google already had a number of the transit providers that were part of this project. They already had them incorporated, and Apple did not. So Apple wanted to see almost a full version of the feed, whereas Google, because they already had partnerships with these people, did not want the chance that there was any duplication. So that's why there was a difference between what Apple was getting and what Google was getting.
So I think I know the answer to this question because this hasn't been yet fully implemented, I believe. Have you seen increases in ridership yet? If so, for which services and by what percentage?
We don't know that yet. But good question.
And I imagine something that you're going to be looking at if possible.
Yes.
Okay, we have another question that is, I think, being typed in. Give it a couple seconds. Oh, no, okay. So how about if we move on to lessons learned, and then when this question comes in, we'll answer it.
All right, so the lessons learned, I'll go through this briefly. A lot of these topics I've kind of already touched on. First, that this is somewhat of a leading edge project. While GTFS is a fairly well documented format and structure, combining a whole bunch of 15, 20 plus agency feeds into a single feed is a fairly new thing. So we had to kind of work our way through that process, just kind of inventing steps as we went. And it kind of leads into sort of our next thing is, we found that even, there were some gaps in, data tools. While, there are some big software scheduling tools out there that helps large-scale, large-size transit agencies perform scheduling, and then just happens to be able to dump out GTFS feed as an output. And there are some smaller-scale tools. It was pretty limited. So, that's why we came to the conclusion, well, we had to come up and build some templates and a couple different formats of templates to help fill that gap in the middle where agencies really needed some support and how to maintain this when they didn't already have tools to help support that the data maintenance aspect and the GTFS format. So as Gabby mentioned, agency participation is critical in this whole process. I mean, that 30% of that the feeds that we had to develop for them for the agencies, it's up to them and critical that they have someone just do that maintenance and when updates occur. And we try to make that process as simple and painless as possible with setting everything all up, giving them multiple options for data maintenance. But it's important that that data stays current. Obviously, any riders that run into inaccuracies and errors in the data because of outdated information will get frustrated. We don't want to reach that situation to discourage people from using the data. So it's agency participation is critical in this process. As I had noted, agency categorization and this is kind of a twofold thing. As we started the project, it was kind of looked at, we were going to look at a whole bunch of different types of shared ride agencies. We really had to kind of pare it down into a single type just to kind of keep the focus so that we can get this built out, and then with future potential being looking at some of those other types of feeds. And also the other thing was some of the agency categorization that we came up with in the very beginning, the 1 through 5. It was surprising that a lot of the agencies already had data there, and some of the other categorizations of 3, 4, and 5 really didn't end up really being that useful. It ended up being, the top ones ended up being the ones that were most prevalent. So that was interesting to find. And last, I think, we kind of found through the project that the TMAs really need to have involvement in this process. They know the regions best. They know the services best in their area. They can help foster this process as it goes into maintenance. So that's a critical piece as well. So I stop for questions, or do you want to?
Yes, great. There is one question. Did you say there is a GTFS-like system for bike shares? I think this relates to a comment that was made very in the very beginning.
Right. Yeah. So there is out there a general bike share feed specification. It's available. It's, I would say, kind of still in development, sort of in its infancy. Hasn't really. I mean, I think we kind of dug up and found it on, GitHub that someone's developing it. So I would say it's just starting to, maybe get used, but it's certainly not fully vetted. So it's out there, but I don't know I can't speak to how well it works or any of that stuff. We just didn't really get into it.
And Justin, I'll echo that part of what we discovered during the workshop, that some of the on-demand formats and data out there is some of that's unstructured and in development. I know IBI, with their work in Connecticut and Boston, were looking at developing products that supported on-demand, but it's something that in this project we weren't, I guess, that level of maturity in terms of the types of products that we could promise to deliver.
Okay, thank you. And I see one more question that is being typed in. Zenobia, would you like to make your closing remarks, and then we'll take any remaining questions after that.
Sure. So I think where we are now is that we know that we're just at the beginning. We have only about 15 providers, but our key thing is that we don't want this, just like planning, you don't want a shelf document. We don't want this to be a shelf process. We want to make sure that we continue building on this and we're able to share the information that we have with other vendors. So right now, of course, Google and Apple, those are our pioneers. So those are those third-party vendors that we're sharing with now. We believe that there are others out there. We originally went out to over 40 different transit providers, asking them to participate in this process. So outreach is going to be ongoing. I mean, we have close to over 384 municipalities in our region. All of those, of course, don't provide transit services, but those who do, we hope that we can engage them in this process. We hope that we get to a point where right now we're only looking at designated routes. What if we looked at non-designated routes? We currently also, with our Transportation Management Association, we look at New Jersey ride share. So looking at carpooling, van pooling. There's certain software where you can create the general transit fee specification off of that. We hope to look into that, expanding into that realm as well. We mentioned about the bike share and other things, and Solomon was saying about some of the things with the on-demand services. I want to go back to the way we started with this project, is that we were looking to provide more travel option information. So where we see going with this project is how do we fill that gap with that travel option information that is currently missing. So with that, I imagine we have more questions, and I'll just say thank you for your time.
Terrific. Thanks, Gabby. And in fact, there are two more questions. The first of the two is, can you share the zip file you're providing to Google, the one that only contains GTFS for agencies that weren't already publishing a feed?
So we would have to make a separate request. What we provide for Google, it's just for them. Our general, what you're seeing on our website right now, that is everything. You can reach out to us if you have any custom requests.
And then the last question is, has Google or Apple already published this data in their apps, or will these data appear in the future?
They have not published the GTFS feeds yet. They are currently testing it on their systems to make sure that we've provided them with an accurate, up-to-date, and validated feed, and that it's going to work. So they usually do, I think it's like a 2 to 3 week testing period. So we're currently in that kind of testing phase. So I would say maybe in the next couple of weeks, mid-July, that's a rough approximation, that you would see the new transit services that we're providing them in the feeds on their system.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions being typed into the chat, and so on behalf of the I-95 Corridor Coalition and all the presenters, we'd like to thank our audience, and I personally would like to thank our presenters. You did a great job, and I think the questions and the commentary that was going back and forth is testament to the level of interest in this project, and it's been a long time coming, so thank you very much. And we will have the entire recording posted to the Coalition's website, and an email will be sent out to everyone who was registered so that you can access that. So thank you again. Have a good afternoon.